local people, important issues. CBS 10 WILM's weekly focus on the Lower Cape Fear region. This is Byline Wilmington with your host, Donn and Sal.
And good morning, welcome. This Tuesday, as the 44th President of the United States of America takes the oath of office, the 8-year run of President George W. Bush is in the hands of history. How will history write the W legacy? Well, today we're taking a look with our guests. Dr. Stephen Meinhold is a political science from UNC Wilmington, and Dr. Candice Bredbenner is an associate professor of history. And thank you both for joining us. This is a pretty big subject, so we're going to try to get our arms around it. Let's jump right into it. What are some of the things that you think defines the legacy of a president, Steve?
Well, presidents are judged by big things. So when we look back at the presidency of George Bush, what we're going to be looking at, without a doubt, is war and the economy.
Economic issues are if there is no war, that's a huge definer of a presidency. How the economy is doing or did during their run.
Well, certainly in two-term presidencies, there are almost always international events that do shape a presidency in some fashion. So, as a rule, while the economic conditions are very important, there is an international component, and has been historically in our country, to the way that historians and political scientists evaluate presidency.
Candice, what do you think are some of the, not specific to the Bush presidency, but some of the issues that define a presidency?
Well, I think I would agree with Steve that it's how presidents handle major developments, crises. In this case, Bush had 3 major crises. He had a major terrorist attack, he had a major natural disaster, and a major economic disaster. And so I think that oftentimes Americans like to see, of course, how their president performs under that kind of stress. And those are the real tests of leadership. And, sorry.
No, that, you said the terrorist attack, the national disaster.
Yeah, I meant Katrina.
Right.
Sorry.
And the economic collapse. You didn't mention the war in Iraq. Is that part of that mix
well,
for him?
Yes, I'm connecting 9/11 and Iraq and Afghanistan.
Because he did connect it.
Yes.
Yeah. We'll examine actually those 4, I guess, in more detail. But first, he's leaving office. Bush is leaving office with one of the lowest public approval numbers ever. What kind of an impact might that have on how history will see the presidency? Is there a connection?
Well, sometimes there is, but at other times, some presidents actually recover from that, and their long-term reputation, let's say in the eyes of historians, takes an uptick. And I think that Bush is counting on that. And he seems rather confident, in fact, that he said many times that he thinks history will judge him better than the president.
Yeah. For example, Harry Truman left office with some pretty low numbers, and his numbers have moved up in history during the time. Is that likely to happen with Bush?
Well, I don't think we can know. I think the circumstances have changed a little bit. The way that we typically, there are a couple ways that we typically think about how we measure the legacy of a president, and it really comes down to 2. One is what people are going to write about the president and the president's administration and the actions of the president and his staff. The other is this sort of less erudite way, which is these polls that are conducted of political scientists and historians and other scholars, where they send these things out. I've gotten one in the past. They send them out and they say, we want you to rate all of the presidents from great to awful. And that's really one of the ways that we collect information about presidencies and how they get rated. So there's this sort of body of literature that will be written about the president, monographs by scholars like Candice and others, and then there will be this
time moves
other
on,
group.
the perception might change.
It often does change.
Often
And when you look at these ratings, you'll see some change. You don't see much at the great, and you don't see much at the bottom. You know, we know pretty much where Lincoln and Washington are going to go. We pretty much where Harding and it's going to.
But Truman did move from
Yeah,
the lower tier to a upper middle tier. Would you say? One of the big criticisms I've heard about the Bush years, his approach to the Constitution and his views on presidential powers. Candice, this is one of your areas of focus.
Yeah.
What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think first, to put it in historical context, I mean, some of the basic concept that Bush has put forward about executive privilege during wartime is not new. And Lincoln invoked it, FDR, Nixon. And so that part of it isn't really unique to Bush. And it's the idea that sometimes what occurs or the actions that a president has to take during wartime might otherwise be seen as unconstitutional, but because of the crisis circumstances, they are not. But I would say in operation, though, during the Bush administration, it seems to have taken on a more extreme interpretation.
Do you think he changed the scope of the office, or is it intact?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. Is how much has Bush differed from some of the other presidents who have tried to expand the presidential power? We already had an imperial presidency before Bush took office. I mean, for the most part, the presidency and the executive branch dominate our national public dialogue at this point. The legislative branch and the judicial branch have really diminished in their importance. But what's different, I think, about Bush, and what strikes people as different about him, is that not only has he expanded the powers of the presidency, but he's made them somehow hyper-partisan. And so this expansion of power is connected to partisanship. And I think that's where we have all these scandals within the administration where we're expanding power, but we're expanding it in a political way, not in a constitutional way, or to say, well, I'm expanding power to protect the Constitution. It's almost as if they're expanding power to increase partisanship or to try to change the partisan playing field.
Well, at one point, I think Karl Rove, an advisor to the president, said that we now have a permanent Republican majority, and it will be like that.
He probably regrets that. That does. Or
We'll
regrets
talk,
saying that.
actually, we're going to talk about some of the names that were,
I did want to say a little bit
Yeah.
more about executive privilege before we move on. And that is, I think it's also the context in which this doctrine has been invoked. I absolutely agree with you. We had an imperial presidency before this. But Bush is applying it in a context of a new kind of war. The Bush administration argues it is a different kind of war. I would agree. It is one in which victory, what does that mean from the U.S. side? That's unclear. It also, as the Bush administration has said, and I think this is true, could very well be a war for generations. So the argument that he's making about executive privilege, which seems to challenge the basic rule of law, I mean, he's defied domestic law, he's defied international law, and justified it by this idea of executive privilege. He also seems to have challenged the basic idea of checks and balances. He doesn't think that he needs congressional consent for some major actions, and he seems to be rather angry at the Supreme Court for making judgments on some of his policies.
We're going to hold it there. We're going to hold it there. We're going to come back. And when we come back, we're going to move on to the war in Iraq. Stay with us. Our guest, Dr. Stephen Meinhold, Dr. Candice Bredbenner from UNC Wilmington. Stay with us. We'll be right back.